Well, welcome home, President Joe Biden, back from Europe and ready to brag about accomplishments at the G20 summit and a visit with the Pope. He's hit with trouble in almost every direction. The infrastructure and Build Back Better bill, those still have not been a done deal, not at all, not by a long shot. Inflation and supply chain crisis, that still continues. So does the border crisis. The Delta variant breakthrough cases are up, and vaccine mandates are grounding military members and infuriating businesses with over 100 employees. Right now, the vast majority of Americans think we are on the wrong track. Not exactly the welcome home Joe Biden was hoping for. Joining us now is Dave Dulio, Director of the Center for Civic Engagement and Political Science, Professor at Oakland University. Good morning, Dave. How are you?
Good morning, Kevin. I'm well. How are you?
Yeah, and I didn't even bring up the Virginia election. That's probably on his mind a little bit, too. There is a lot going on for this president whose approval ratings are going down week after week. Where does he start? He's home now. How does he prioritize some of this stuff?
I think that's a question that the White House is struggling with at the moment. You went through a litany of issues that are all working against the president at this time. So it's no surprise that he's at about 43% approval, 51% disapproval right now. If you look at at all the polling that's out there, certainly underwater. And it's tough to point to one thing that he could go after that would see those numbers turn around. I think he may have come back from this trip and approached things very differently had Terry McAuliffe won in Virginia and Governor Murphy had won by 10 points or so in New Jersey. That didn't happen. It's a very different political environment now than when he left. And I think that the Republican successes on Election Day Tuesday really sort of shake things up from a national political perspective, and might mean the White House is trying to make some different decisions on which way they go.
I'm kind of curious what the 43% who approve are happy with. He used to when something went wrong, he used to go right to the pandemic and talk about COVID because he was really strong on that. But I'm not sure that playbook works right now because people are really concerned about inflation in the economy, and they're worried that these vaccine mandates are going to create more problems with worker shortages and ultimately with inflation, and people are worried about if their paychecks are going to make it. Can he go back to COVID, which it seems like he do?
Well, he does get better marks on handling COVID in terms of approval rating than he does in really any other area. Economy, foreign policy, immigration is another one, and it's that 43% is mostly Democrats, right? He remains strong with his base at roughly 90% approval from Democrats. But the key area for his losses in terms of job approval is with independents. He won independents in 2020 by double digits. And in Virginia on Tuesday, they went for Mr. Youngkin by about 15 points. So it was a huge swing in independent voters in the last year. And given that, Virginia is one state in 1 year, but it still is pretty telling.
They've been talking about Virginia, and they've been talking about the suburbs and women voters in the suburbs. What issues have the people in the suburbs attached themselves to most? And they've talked a lot about education too, which we haven't talked about that at all yet.
Well, and I think that's a big factor. I think schools, education. I think the race in Virginia really turned for Terry McAuliffe when he said in the last debate that he didn't think that parents should have any say in what their kids learn at school. I think that the dynamics of that race shifted almost immediately, and parents in those suburban areas, even in some strongly Democratic counties in Virginia, those right around the the Beltway outside of Washington, D.C., heavily Democratic. But McAuliffe's performance was much worse this year than Biden's was in 2020. And I think that it was that issue of what are my kids learning in school, and what role do we as parents have? That's something that really had a big impact.
Yeah, Biden's numbers really started to slip right around Afghanistan and the withdrawal, which was not one of the things I mentioned on this litany of problems either. Can he go back and start to try and fix some of the mistakes that were made, or does he just try and say, all right, look, this we're in a bad spot with our approval rating. Let's just start over, and from here on try and build it back up and not look back but just look forward?
Well, I think that's one option that's on the table for sure, but I think it would be framed around these two pieces of legislation that you mentioned that are still trying to work their way through the legislative process on Capitol Hill. But if Democrats go all in on the Build Back Better bill, the social spending side of it, the $1.75 or $2 trillion plan that is still trying to get negotiated between the progressives and the centrist Democrats. If they go all in on that, I think that could spell trouble, because there's nothing in the results from Tuesday in either Virginia or New Jersey that would make somebody like Joe Manchin or Kristen Sinema take notice and say, yeah, I'm looking at those election results and I really want to vote for this big social spending package now. That's really going to make my constituents in West Virginia and Arizona happy. I think the exact opposite happened, and Joe Manchin himself yesterday said something similar, which was along the lines of, hey, look, we should probably slow this down and really think about what our constituents want.
Yeah, I listened to Joe Manchin talk for about 15 minutes yesterday, and it was very interesting. And a lot of it was the things he said before, but in the wake of what happened in Virginia, he really had a pump the brakes kind of feeling about Build Back Better, and he was even talking about, hey, remember the pandemic aid, that $1 trillion that we sent out, that money's still out there and available. We should be using that money first and maybe pass this infrastructure bill and then maybe talk about if we need additional money. He really was pumping the brakes.
Absolutely, and I think the infrastructure package is something that could produce some positive results for the White House and for Democrats on Capitol Hill. They can, if that is passed and it starts to get implemented, Democrats can point to that as on a couple of fronts. One, it was done in a bipartisan manner, which Americans support that kind of work on Capitol Hill, and it addresses issues that are practical, everyday things that Americans confront, right? Whether it's roads and bridges or airports, rail, it's stuff that Americans can see and feel every day when they're driving down the road. And it's this common sense solution to these problems that Americans really gravitate to, rather than some big, bold, ideological agenda in either direction. I would say the same thing if conservatives were pushing something, if they had control of all levers of government in Washington. Americans they prefer incremental change rather than massive systematic change after a pretty close election last year.
All right, Dave Dooley, Oakland University. Thanks so much for your time. Very interesting. We're going to have to see what people do on both sides to win over the independents. Just fascinating. Thank you for your time.
My pleasure.